Thanks, Will. You're going to hear a lot of similarities between the talk that we just heard and some of the concepts that we're approaching within the Game Commission. Thanks for the intro. We'll just roll right in. So our mission as a state agency with a large land base of about 1.5 million acres of state game lands in Pennsylvania is really focused on wildlife outcomes, managing and protecting wildlife and their habitats while promoting hunting and trapping for current and future generations. This is really a primary objective that defines all of the forestry work that we do. Everything is habitat centric. And in alignment with those goals, each game lands is individually managed according to a comprehensive management plan built by regional staff that serve those game lands for desired future habitat conditions based on priority wildlife species and the opportunities in those landscapes. So this kind of approach, having really a sole focus on habitat, gives our foresters a lot of flexibility in their approaches to silviculture that lets us try some interesting stuff. So we've been experimental in our approaches to late succession. So why do we care so much about late successional management in particular? We are going to probably muddy up some terms a little bit. When we talk about late succession, we're really talking about a system rather than a specific structural condition. And we'll get a little bit more into that later. But
Sarah, I just wanted to interrupt you real quick. Are you sharing slides? Because we're not seeing them.
Shoot, sorry. Huh. Rookie mistake. Did not start the screen share. One moment. Thanks for that. I'll go back so you can see this beautiful picture of our colleague Aaron Tyson. Underlining that some of those metrics I just talked about, our 1.5 million acre system, and that focus on comprehensive management planning, as well as the mission there, which you can read faster than I can talk. So why we care? We want to do a little bit of everything, everywhere, all the time.
So as Sarah mentioned, each game lands has a comprehensive plan. And this is like a very common excerpt from one of our game lands plans. I'd say particularly from the larger forested game lands, you know, multi-thousand acre parcels. And I'll read it because it's pretty important for the rest of the talk. Forest management goal for such and such game lands is to develop and maintain highly interspersed forest age classes at the landscape level while ensuring desirable species composition and structural diversity at the stand level. So that includes attention to both young and old forests, because to have intermixed, interspersed age classes, you need, a bunch of different age classes, including old ones. And it's also important because it calls out both our interest in species composition and also structural complexity at the stand level. So on a lot of our big game lands, this is kind of the landscape that we want to create, a really wide range of habitat conditions. We achieve a lot of that through commercial timber sales, even age management, fire, and just creating that really diverse landscape of a lot of different habitat types.
To Paul's earlier point, where on a large landscape, different landowners have different opportunities to sort of emphasize or specialize in certain types of management. We recognize that happens in the wider landscape, but even within our own footprint of land, that's really what we're after. We want to do a little bit of everything.
So this is sort of just kind of summing up some of our thoughts as we kind of prepared for this. At the landscape level, our approach to late succession is that it's the strategic designation and arrangement of permanent mature forest patches that kind of form the background of our diversified landscape. So we're going to do a lot of things on the landscape, but it's always important to have these structurally complex mature forests. And so they, of course, benefit wildlife species that like late successional structure, but they also, super important, they benefit a ton of generalist species and young forest dependent species when they're interspersed in that landscape of a lot of different age classes. And I think that's a really key thing to understand about how we approach late successional management. So this is just a map of one of our bigger game lands. It's over 20,000 acres. And our approach to kind of planning And I noticed that in the intro to this webinar, there was a real similar management typing approach called out on a map. So that's pretty cool. So I'll just explain these real briefly because they're important to understand our approach here. So on this particular game lands, 42% of it is in what we call mixed succession management. And so I think the easiest way to quickly describe that is even age management. So that's where we're managing for a kind of maximum age class diversity, largely through commercial timber sales. So pretty significant part of the landscape. 16% of this game lands is in fire management. So the way to think about that is essentially those are places managed as open oak woodlands where we've generally reduced the basal area and we're using fire as a primary management tool to kind of maintain that open habitat. So there's aspects of that have some late successional elements because a lot of those trees are going to stay there forever or until they die on their own. But it does have that repeated understory disturbance. And I'll skip late and go to reserve. So 24% of this game lands is in reserve, which is essentially passive late successional management. We're not doing anything in there. We're going to probably spray it for spongy moth, but that's about it. We're not doing anything in there. Those are drainages. Those are tough places to access, sensitive sites. So it's a significant area of the game lands. And then lastly on this one, almost 20%, 18% is actively managed for late successional conditions. That's the dark green on this map here. And you can kind of see there are large areas that are in that category. There are small patches in that category, kind of scattered all over the game lands. And that's the management type that we're going to be talking about that today. And just, to kind of point out that this game lands isn't a real anomaly. It's in line with kind of the average of those designations across the north central region. So which areas do we designate for late successional management type? And I think it's important to note that those places aren't late successional now necessarily. They're places that we want to develop those conditions. It is not just the inoperable areas that a lot of our reserve areas are those places, but the late successional areas are a mix of primarily operable areas, some areas that are tough to operate in, but they represent that full range of forest types on the landscape. And we're in particular focusing on important forest types for wildlife, like conifer dominated stands. On this game lands, it's going to be white oak or healthy oak hickory stands. Corridors connecting old forests to each other, so connecting reserve areas to other reserve areas. And then smaller stands that are just critical for maintaining that habitat interspersion. So stands that are in a highly managed, even age dominated landscape. And we just recognize a healthy oak forest that we want to kind of maintain as a long-term mass producing stand in that landscape.
So that kind of helps us choose where we initiate these strategies, but then things get really granular down at the stand level where the individual taps and trajectories of the stand dynamics in those places are really played with. So stands that are designated for late successional management are most useful for wildlife when they are on a trajectory of desired species resilience and continued structural complexity. What that basically means is that we look at late succession as a system, not as an objective necessarily. So it's not like accomplishing a certain structural condition and saying, great, we did it. It's rather trying to manage this machine that will sort of continuously replace itself and offer something that is a persistent system on the landscape, not just a singular pulse of structure. We believe that active management is really essential to improving that trajectory for many stands, particularly when it comes to that species resiliency concept, which we'll speak a lot more about. So when we think about this, we realize that it's not, I liked Paul's terms of old growthiness on a continuum, that there are these elements of structure that can be plussed up in certain areas, but really we kind of reach for different opportunities in different spaces. Overall, when we think about our definitions, it's not so much restoration of old growth as multi-age forest systems for wildlife that can persist for that long time. So the way that we've kind of focused our objectives in these areas is that we're prioritizing the development of desirable species resiliency. If we have a forest type made up of vegetative species that are desirable, that are functional, that are functioning for wildlife, we want to maintain those species in those places. So this gets at those shade tolerance choices of the intensity of management, trying to match the appropriateness of the species there. Many passive approaches might actually result in species shifts away from less shade tolerant species. So we try to match to maintain desirable species over time. The mechanisms that we reach for those four is through trying to establish multiple cohorts. So the opportunity for that stand to replace itself, resiliently spawn to unplanned disturbance, and the maintenance of continuous mature cover of big trees in the main canopy at all times. So second, to achieve structural goals over time as a byproduct of regeneration treatments. When we think about all of these desirable things that happen in older forests or late successional-ish forests, we think about these structural attributes and we really prioritize those, but we think about the hardest thing to do first, the regeneration events that result in these multiple cohorts. And these structural goals we look at as things that happen over time in this system, in that sort of pipeline of development of structural features. The variability that happens as a result of that sort of overtime building and the variability of the multiple cohort establishment happens over a long time scale. So additional unplanned disturbance that meets that stand will kind of additionally add further variability and help us kind of increase complexity overall. And finally, where some of those structural features are really important to us, we'll set specific targets and try to plus them up. Things like snags or den holes in certain areas through aggressive retention or other active management strategies. This is kind of I'm spending a lot of time on this slide, but this is really kind of the major set of principles that we're using to guide our choices about assigning silvicultural prescriptions in late successional areas.
So, a stand like this, it has a lot of things going for it from a potential future late successional stand. It's got a lot of mid-story complexity. There's quite a bit of variability in tree size. There's some woody debris. There's snags. But the trajectory of this stands like pretty poor, especially from a species resiliency standpoint. It's got nothing but hay-scented fern in the understory, striped maple in the mid-story. As this stand begins to get old and fall apart on its own, we're not gonna really achieve the kind of habitat objectives that we want in a stand like this. So although some stands look pretty good now, their trajectory is pretty poor, and that one is kind of hard to improve without a lot of investment. So on the other hand, this stand doesn't necessarily check all those boxes right now. It's kind of lacking that understory and mid-story structure, not a lot of dead wood, but it doesn't have tons of interference. It's got a really good carpet of established white oak regen. This one has a lot of opportunity for us to improve the trajectory and really do some good work in here. So I think that, to kind of sum up that approach, we're definitely being opportunistic. We're not only working in these stands, but we're going to focus our first effort on stands that kind of we can see some easy wins, like good regen or a place where you can expect to get some regen established, not a ton of invasives, stands that already have multiple cohorts. There's quite a lot of stands that have 2 ages already. And a big one for us is deer pressure. If low or moderate deer pressure is going to make things a lot easier. And of course, stands that already have some of those old forest structural features, it's nice to start there.
So when we talk about those structural features, this is where we really enjoy having so many biologists on staff that help us see things through eyes of someone who knows how critters use it. So many of those that Paul and Tony just walked through, big trees and small trees, a variety of things in different places along the landscape. The structural elements of conifer and thermal cover, the complexity horizontally and vertically, brushy areas with like high stem densities that are really low, no brush, downwood and snags and cavities for those cover features. Those are the things that are really obvious to us, but they help us also see things like, well, when you have real big trees with crowns that have been opened and really expanded and occupying big space over high stem density and low cover, then you have mast coming down over cover, which is a really unique kind of condition that might only happen where you have those two distinct layers happening. We've also kind of focused on soft mast releases of things like serviceberry and some of these mid-canopy species that we see as really important, and overall maintaining that diversity of species. So when we look at these places, we often look at them and think, well, this is pretty cool. It's got some old forest elements in the structural complexity, but boy, when you walk through them, they really have a lot of features that we associate favorably with young stands that we think are great for early successional species. So this is kind of, we started throwing around this term just within ourselves that this, maybe it's a 30% solution. If it's 30% as good as early succession and actually showing some early successional habitat features, maybe it becomes a marginal place that's used by early successional species nearby other areas that have more like turnover of acres that's creating new and continuous opportunities for early succession. But because it's a late successional system that's going to be managed persistently in this way to keep this type of cover and structure, it's a persistent, though suboptimal version of early successional. So we see this as a thing that kind of extends the envelope of all of the other types of management around us, and therefore really important in a strategic place in that landscape context. Do you want to mention Kirk there?
This is one of our, it's actually the forester for the game lands that we're going to be talking about here. And I mean, we routinely flush grouse in these, late successional stands. There's rabbits all through them. And I think it's because of that variability in structure that includes areas of like quite high stem density with all the woody debris. So it has kind of altered our thinking on what wildlife species are going to benefit from this type of work. So we're going to kind of like focus in on a few projects now, and it's on this game lands that we looked at earlier, and it's in those dark green stands at the southern end that are circled there that are really in a highly managed landscape. Like a lot of the lighter green areas have been harvested recently, so there's some, quite a few young forest patches, and a lot of the stands in dark green were designated because they were important areas to maintain as mature forest habitat for the long term. A lot of them had pretty decent regen. They had some existing complex structure from previous management. They had some scattered big wolfy oaks, a decent conifer component, which is important to us, and not a lot of invasives. So that's just some of the pre-existing attributes of these stands. And so we'll go through a couple of them now. So the first one is pretty interesting. Commercially thinned in 1993, so that we had no late successional designation back then. So it was thinned. It really created kind of a two-age stand where there were residual oaks in the overstory, mostly white oak, but it regenerated kind of a second age class of cherry, red maple, serviceberry, and a few oaks. And then kind of when we got to it, it had this pole layer of those species in kind of a very patchy way. So we already saw like the opportunity because it had this complex structure forming. So a bunch of those overstory oaks died in 2008, 9, 10 because of a spongy moth outbreak. And they were salvaged, and that reduced the basal area of the big trees to like down to 30 to 60 BA. So you can see in that top picture, the big trees are kind of scattered. Probably not as many as you'd like to have, but that's just the hand we're dealt there. But a bunch of regen got established during that period, a period of relatively low deer pressure. And so the forester at the time kind of saw this opportunity to go in 2017 and release some of those competitive oak seedlings, really make a third age class, and kind of work through some of that pole cherry also. So in that bottom picture, you can kind of see that kind of on the bottom left side of that picture is like a patch of that pole cherry, and then there's a kind of residual patch of big oaks. So that's kind of what this stand looks like.
You can also see some of the serviceberry. When we took these drone shots, they were in flower, so they stand out really well in these pictures.
Yep. So this was completed quite a few years ago, And so our approach then with these stands was very much like an area-wide prep cut approach, which we're probably going to change a little bit going forward, but it worked out pretty well in these stands. So this one basically had an area-wide prescription to cut all the 1 to 10 inch red maple and black birch. It was pretty much that simple. And so those were mostly those 30-plus-year-old poles, and kind of working through thinning some of those cherry pockets. And we really didn't do anything with that residual oak overstory because there just wasn't enough of them to lose any. And so 7 years later, what we see in this stand is really successful release of that oak sapling layer. So now we have pockets of 10 to 15 foot tall oak saplings mixed with serviceberry. The pole cherry and serviceberry have continued to progress and form like a really nice mid-story pockets in places. But any future treatments in here, we really have to defer because we cut kind of too many of the trees we don't like in the first entry. We had really good regeneration results, but at this point the woody debris that we cut is breaking down and almost gone. There's not a lot of wood left over from the previous harvest, and because we pretty much cut all the undesirable mid-story trees, we didn't retain anything that we want to lose. So now mostly what's left are big oaks and kind of those pole cherries. So we learned that lesson here, that our ability to continuously provide those structural features kind of is going to be a challenge here.
So to kind of like call back to some of those management concepts that Tony and Paul talked about and that we've kind of hinted at in our primary objectives, what happened in this project was looking at an opportunity and reacting to it. So Tony talked about emulating natural disturbance patterns. In this case, it was observing and seeing a natural disturbance pattern happen and then reacting to it. So there was an existing opportunity that's a low-hanging fruit. We got to go for it. And that mid-story structure really was like tended and plussed up. So that mid-story structure in this case, thinking about the trajectory, comes from 2 places: things that will stay, the serviceberry, witch hazel, some of the conifer elements, and mid-story structure that will eventually succeed to the main canopy and give us more options. So those cherry poles and the regeneration that we see in those places. So the approaches were designed to respond to those opportune pockets to release them. And then here, not saying like, well, we ran out of deadwood options to really create new pulses for a while, I guess we won't do late succession there, but just adjusting the goals for the trajectory of that stand to deprioritize some of those structural goals for now, to accommodate the realities of stand development and look for those opportunities later. So in this case, 1 entry started things, and then the stand caught this stochastic disturbance of the spongy moth mortality, which then we reacted to. So it's a kind of a combination of light management and then reactionary management in this case. We'll also mention that we had some validation of this 30% concept that we have, that young forest species can use these stands and do use these stands. You can read faster than we can talk, but Dr. Jeff Larkin did some work in here of detections of both mature forest birds as well as young forest preferring birds that were occupying this space and using the structure there.
So another project, it's somewhat similar. It had 2 previous commercial harvests in 87 and 95 that resulted in residual oak basal area of about 50, plus all the conifer was reserved at that time. So there's quite a good conifer component in this one, which is cool for us. And also those foresters back then retained all the serviceberry and all the witch hazel. So you have these kind of old growth witch hazel patches in there, which is pretty neat. That 95 harvest similarly resulted in regen pockets that were now pole maple, birch, and cherry, and kind of wolfy white pines, with a really nice wildlife shrub understory and a bunch of oak regen that had accumulated during between the 90s and the mid 2000s. So once again, forester Aaron Tyson, he recognized this opportunity, and to kind of get a third cohort developed to kind of thin through that pole layer to kind of increase tree growth there. And that was the aim of this project. So this one was kind of an area-wide prescription by description, focusing on cutting the red maple and black birch poles and also thin through the cherry pockets to kind of create some crown stratification within those pockets, daylighting wildlife shrubs, and most importantly, releasing those pockets of oak regen. So that resulted in basically about all the 1 to 8 inch maple and birch were cut, some cherry also, and a few larger white pine here and there. So 7 growing seasons later, same thing. We got a really good release of the oak and other desirable regen. So we have a definite third age class going. You can start to see some dominant cherry forming in that second age class, which is adding to that structural complexity. The nice thing about this one is there are still sufficient 8 to 14 inch kind of small saw timber red maple and some white pine that we don't really need. We're happy to have those there now because we can use them to cut or girdle later to expand gaps, further release that regen, and help us meet those structural goals. Interestingly, in this one, there's still a lot of woody debris from that 1995 oak harvest. There's a lot of top wood still laying in there. So that's adding some structural complexity as well.
I'll notice here on these pictures, you can really see how the prescription by description approach, kind of scenario-based approaches to marking, really helps kind of show like these little sort of variable patches in the application of those prescriptions. So here, a lot of the same concepts underlie this project. It was reacting to opportunities. It sort of assures that mid-story structure. The thing I really want to focus on here that's different is that here, really explicitly, the scenario prescriptions targeted every cohort stage of development. So there's overstory manipulation, there's tending of poles, there's attention to regeneration. So you're doing stand tending as well as regeneration opportunities in the same entry, which is really what you need once you get into these three cohort systems.
So the last one here we'll talk about, it's called Miles Run. So this one is kind of more kind of useful to look at for a lot of folks, I think, because it's more representative of what we have a lot of places. Unmanaged stand never had any previous harvest that we know of course, since it was clear cut in 1910 or something. It had some limited spongy moth mortality in the overstory 15 years ago or so, and that increased light level kind of spurred the development of some mid-story species. It also established a nice cohort of oak regen. This was an area that was just surrounded by a lot of even age management, and it was identified as an important place to retain as a mature forest patch. So the goals here were focused on releasing the competitive oak kind of across the whole stand, and increasing woody debris in particular to help protect the seedlings from deer browse and elk browse in the case of this place. So just looking at like an uncut area to a cut area, you get a lot more overstory than the last couple stands, and a lot more trees were cut in here because it hadn't been managed before. So a lot more woody debris was created. So this was another area-wide prescription. Mostly it was kind of like a preparatory cut because we're really focused on developing that competitive oak regen, but where possible, we cut it a little bit harder to release patches of existing oak and conifer and serviceberry. So the bottom picture is a picture of a gap that we kind of walked and estimated that it was maybe 1/4 of an acre or a little bit less than 1/4 of an acre. That was the biggest gap we could find, and kind of all the woody debris laying there. So non-utilization in this entry. So this stand has never had any utilization as far as we know. Now, 7 or 8 years later, really good response from the regen layer. There's a lot more structural things going on in this stand because the large oak that died from spongy moth are still there, creating some big snags and big woody debris. The variable cutting based on the amount of regen has created a lot of horizontal structural complexity. And we got plenty of residual trees that we don't care about that much to kill or cut later to kind of continue building structural complexity. And for all these stands, the issue going forward is deer pressure is really increased in this landscape, and our ability to establish additional cohorts is kind of in doubt. So just some nice pictures of it. We're kind of running toward the end, so we'll blow through a few slides here and then wrap it up.
Yeah, just to reinforce, this project really highlights the concept of there was a lot of nearby early successional work happening. So a lot of clear cuts, a lot of overstory removals. This was sort of a strategic location to hold some complex overstory structure. And this one was that approach to a more intact stand. So that area-wide prep was something about like reacting to the current opportunities, but also setting up the future, not just creating holes and hoping something happens. It was kind of a combination of both things to start things moving, but in terms of regeneration environment, but also responding to exact opportunities to do direct gap releases.
So we won't really talk about these, just some other pictures of kind of the area-wide approach that we've taken and some other stands, several years after the treatment. This is a little time series of a more traditional group selection that has been done in smoke stands. So that's pre-cut, year 1, year 2, year 3. So we're watching that development over time.
I just want to mention too that we've kind of focused in on these oak projects because it's kind of a tough nut to crack when you think about these concepts of like high complexity structure and things that we learned from old growth themselves when you're talking about an intermediately shade tolerant system that requires this certain kind of disturbance. But we're doing other approaches in other forest types. A few of the other practices that we're implementing that have implications and opportunities in late succession. Some of our work, we've started using concepts of sub-blocks within an area to prescribe a certain amount of uniformity or non-uniformity in our approaches. That may be something that we start to use in late successional prescriptions. We hinted at some of these scenario-based prescription approaches, which are really commonly reaching for, and the example on the right from Game Lands 13 in the Northeast region, Forester Evan Delp came up with prescription approaches for gap releases in a more mixed wood system. Some expanding gap and gap adjacent thinning cuts from more like traditional Femmelschlag approaches. But also we're doing some interesting things in earlier, younger forests that were maybe designated for late succession, where some non-uniform variable density resets happen, where regeneration was unfavorable. So then you end up with 2 cohorts at age 30 or 40. And that sets a good trajectory for multi-age management. Even though you don't have the big trees yet, you can move towards them. Degraded stands may also offer opportunities to really focus on structure and just try to like rescue or lifeboat those areas and reach for increased diversity and resiliency.
So we've mentioned a few of these things. We won't spend a lot of time on it, but just kind of wrapping it up, we think it's important to be opportunistic and adaptive and watching as things change. If you cut all the trees you don't like at once, then you don't have anything to cut later. So don't do that. Watching our current spongy moth outbreak kill some of our overstory oak has really validated our approach to focus on kind of species resilience. And stands that have a ton of challenges are kind of hard to fit into this approach, and might just be better and sometimes suited to even age management, where you can kind of throw everything at it at once. And with high deer pressure, this approach can be a real problem. And that structure isn't something you can create it right now, but it goes away over time. So it really is a process, not a single target. So we'll just end here that we don't even know if this is late successional management that we're doing, but we're not really sure what else to call it. Our approach is on developing multiple desirable cohorts, and structural attributes are really important. So we think it fits.